Hi guys, welcome to my channel. I am Bearded Dev. Today we're going to be doing a SQL tutorial on creating tables and adding constraints. So we've had a comment posted on one of our videos. What we're going to be covering is how to create a table and then how to add constraints to that table. So this is the comment we got. This is the scenario we're going to be going through. Writer selects a SQL statement to create a new table named login. There's going to be 5 columns: username, password, last update, status and customer ID. Username is going to be the primary key of the table. The password should never be null. The default value of last update should be the current date and time. Now on there it's got Australia time. I live in the UK, so my SQL Server instance is set to UK time. So we're going to be looking at that, and then we're going to be adding a check status to make sure the value a check constraint to make sure the value of the status column can either be active or inactive, and customer ID is going to be a foreign key constraint referencing the customer table. So let's jump over to SQL Server Management Studio and go through this example. So for this example, I'm going to be looking at a new database I've created, user management. It's just got one table in there at the moment, so I'm just going to show you that table. It's only got a few columns in there just for us to look at with the foreign key constraint. So I've just got 2 columns in there, customer ID and customer name, and I've only got 2 rows as well, Tony Morris and Michelle Root. So how are we going to start this off? We're going to be creating our table, and it's going to be called login, and I'm going to put the word login within square brackets because if I don't, SQL will recognize that as a keyword, but we don't want to use it as a keyword within this sense. And then I'm going to open the brackets, and this is where I give my column details. So the first one is going to be a username. Now within our scenario that was listed as text, but we work with character strings in SQL. We're going to set this as a variable character string, so it's going to be a VARCHAR 30. So we can enter up to 30 characters. We don't have to enter 30 characters. It's just better to use a variable character string from a storage perspective. So a username could be 4 characters and it could be anything up to 30 characters. If you have usernames in your table that are going to be longer than that, then you'll need to extend that to accommodate. And we're going to add a not null constraint, so we don't want the username to be able to be null. We don't want to insert nulls into that column. Now the next column we're going to look at is password. Again, I'm going to put that within square brackets because it is a keyword that SQL recognizes, and one of our criteria is to not allow nulls, so again we're going to add a not null constraint, and we're also going to set that as a VARCHAR 30 as well. Like I've just said, if you have passwords that can extend beyond 30 characters, you will need to indicate to SQL the maximum amount of characters accordingly. And then we're going to have a column called last update, which is going to store a date and time, and we're going to give that a date time 2 data type, which is more accurate and less storage. We will be doing other videos on constraints, creating tables and the different data types working with SQL, so keep an eye out for those as well. Again, I'm going to set this to not null, and then we're going to have a column called status. Again, that is a SQL keyword, and status we're just going to set that as a fixed character string of 10 up to 10 characters, and again that's not going to be null. And then we're also going to have customer ID, which is simply going to be an integer, and again that's not going to be null. So if I close brackets now, then we've got a simple create table. Our table is going to be called login. We've got 5 columns, and now we need to have a look at adding these constraints. So let's just go over our criteria again. So the username is going to be the primary key of the table. The password should never be null, so we've already addressed that by adding a not null constraint, which we have to all of our columns. Last update column is going to be the current date and time. and then the status column we can only enter active or inactive, and then on the customer ID we want a foreign key referencing our customer table that I showed you earlier. Okay, so we're going to start off by looking at the primary key, so that is our username column. So how I'm going to add a primary key constraint is I'm going to add the keyword constraint, and then I'm going to give it a name, and because it's a primary key constraint I'm just going to start off with PK, and then I'm going to indicate the table name, which is login, and I'm going to indicate the column name, username, and then I'm going to tell SQL what type of constraint it is, primary key, and then I'm going to indicate the column that we're using as the primary key, which is the username. So that will allow us to add our primary key constraint called PK underscore login username. Then password, all we needed to do was stop adding nulls to that column. We never want that column to be null, so we've added a not null constraint as we have to all of our columns. So let's look at last update. Now for this one we want to add a default constraint that will pick up the current date and time of the server. So a default constraint allows users to indicate what that should be. So if I actually inserted into this table a date and time, it would insert what I actually inputted. But if I didn't indicate anything, it would pick up the default constraint. So again we're going to write the keyword constraint, and as this is a default I'm going to write df, table name which is login, and the column name last update, and that's going to be default, and the default we're going to set as current timestamp. So current timestamp, if I just do select current timestamp, that will pick up the date and time of the server I am working on. So it's currently 12:40 on the 28th of May. If I run a select, that's the result we get. You will also see the get date SQL function. So if I run that, that will give us the same information. The difference between the two is current timestamp. If I just run that again, is portable across different different SQL platforms. So if you was to use if you was to start working with Oracle, for example, current timestamp is still a built-in function, whereas getDate is specific to Microsoft SQL Server. So that's why I always prefer to use current timestamp. Okay, and then status, we need to add a check constraint. So again, it's the keyword constraint. This is going to be CK for check, table name login, and status, and we're going to give it check, status, and then we're going to give it our list of values, which is active and inactive. So that will check to see whether the value is within our list, which is in this case just contains active and inactive. So if I was to add the word new into that column, we should get a failure to say we can't insert it because of the check constraint, but we'll go through some examples after we've created this table. And then customer ID, we're going to add a foreign key constraint which is going to reference our customers table that I showed earlier. So again, we're just going to call this FK just to indicate if we was to look through our constraints, we could easily see what type of constraints they are and what table and columns they apply to. So that's going to be foreign key, and it's going to be on our customer ID within our login table, and then we're also going to indicate the references, which is going to be our customers table, and it's going to look at the same column name within that table, which is customer ID. So both our login and our customers table contain the column customer ID. So what a foreign key constraint will do is limit you adding anything that doesn't exist in the reference table. So as I showed earlier, in our customers table we've only got 2 customer IDs in there at the moment, just 1 and 2. If I was to insert the number the customer ID 3 into our login table once it's created, we should see a failure to say we can't insert that because it doesn't already exist in the customers table. So that ensures our referential integrity. So we could insert that if we didn't have a foreign key constraint, but that would be what's called as orphan data because it doesn't relate back to our customers table. So let's just give this a quick overview. So we're going to be creating a table called login. Our username is going to be set as a VARCHAR 30. We're not going to allow nulls, and there's a constraint on that of a primary key. Our password is again going to be set as VARCHAR 30. We're not going to allow nulls to be inserted into that column. Last update is going to be date time 2. So that's more accurate time and also less storage. And then we've got a default constraint on that column to give the current timestamp. Status column is a char 10, and we're going to add a constraint on there which is a check constraint, so the status can only show active or inactive. And then we have our customer ID column which has got a foreign key constraint reference in our customers table and the customer ID within that table. So if I go ahead and create that table now, that has executed successfully. I'm just going to go over onto the left hand side into Object Explorer and refresh our tables list. And if we look at login and our columns, we can see we've got a gold key next to username to indicate it's a primary key. We also have the letters PK there. And if we look at our customer ID column, we've got a silver or grey key there and the letters FK. If I open up keys, we've got our names in there indicating the names of the keys. And then if I open up constraints, we've got our constraints in there with the different types of icon indicating what different types of constraints they are. Notice that keys are constraints, but they're stored within keys rather than constraints. So let's go ahead and test the table we've created and insert some data. So we're going to insert into our login table, and initially the columns we're going to insert our username, password. We're going to leave out last update, so we're going to check that the default constraint picks up the local time and date. We're also going to insert our status, and we're going to insert our customer ID. So our values, our username is just simply going to be T Morris, just first initial surname. Password we'll set as TM0RR1$. So we've used some special characters within our password. Status, we're going to set that as active. And this is customer ID 1, so we needed to make sure that that references the customer ID in our customers table. So initially we'll just run a select from our login table, so that our newly created table, we shouldn't see any data in there at the moment. Yes, and all rows are, well, we don't have any rows in there. So if I go ahead and run this insert now, we forgot to put a comma in there, so I'll just add that in. I'll just run this insert again, and we've got one row affected. Let's look at our login table now. We can see we didn't indicate last update, but it has picked up the local time and date of our server. So check what your server is currently set to, and it will pick up the local date time from that. Like I say, I'm working in the UK at the moment, that's where I live, so mine is set to British English. It will pick up that time. Wherever you are based in the world, you should have your SQL Server instance set to your time zone, so it will pick up that for you. Now let's just do a test on our foreign key constraint. So we're going to insert, I'm just going to change the username because otherwise that will fail. So I'm just going to change that to tmorris1, and we're going to change our customer ID to 3, which we know doesn't exist within our customers table. So if I try and run that now, we've got the insert statement conflicted with the foreign key constraint. So the foreign key constraint is doing its work there for us. It's preventing us from inserting data that doesn't exist in our reference table, customer ID. let's have a look. Let's talk about our default constraint. So when a default constraint comes into play is if I don't explicitly indicate what I want to insert. So I am going to add that as part of our insert statement, and I'm going to indicate that that's going to be, let's set it to the beginning of the year. I'm just going to change this back to customer ID 1. And so we've explicitly indicated our name there as the first, our last update as the 1st of the 1st. Let's run that insert statement and then run a select from our table, and we can see, paying attention to our last update column, it's inserted the date that we told it to. So the default constraint will only come into play if we don't actually indicate what date we want to use. Now let's have a look at the check constraint. So let's change this from active, let's say new. I'll just change the username and let's try and run that. And again, we've got a failure with the check constraint. So there, our constraint is doing its work for us. So constraints limit the amount of data you are able to add into certain columns, so they're very useful in limiting that. So for example, if we wanted to insert age for individuals, we could set that as a TINYINT, which accepts the values from 0 to 255, but we know we don't really want to be able to insert ages to 255. So data types act as constraints in certain ways, but constraints allow us to further limit the data that we were adding in. So say we only worked with above 18-year-olds, we could set a check constraint to check that the age range is from 18 to 100 if we have customers who, or individuals who are lucky to live that long, but we wouldn't want to go further than that. If we were to just set it to a TINYINT, that means we could insert the value 255 in our age column, and to SQL that would still be valid, but not to what we're trying to achieve. I'm also going to throw another quick table together, and we're just going to call that orders. So we're going to create table orders. We're going to open brackets, and we're just simply going to have an order ID, which is going to be an integer, and we're going to set that as not null, and we're just going to write the keyword primary key, and then we're going to have order date, which is going to be date time 2, and we're just going to set that as not null, and we're going to write default current timestamp. So if we now execute that, so we've got our order ID, which is an integer, not null, which is going to be our primary key, order date, date time 2, not null, default constraint of current timestamp. So you might see create table statements written like this, and I'll just show you the difference between actually indicating the keyword constraint. So if I now execute that, I'll refresh our table list in Object Explorer. Let's have a look in orders. So we've got our order ID with the gold P and the PK. If I open up keys, SQL has actually given that key constraint a name for us. And then if I open up constraints as well, again it's given that name for us. So this is pretty common. I like to actually indicate to SQL what I'd like the name to be. So if we compare that to login, if we open up keys, you can see the difference between those names and constraints as well. So that just, SQL just generates a random, it is, you know, okay. We can see we've got PK orders and then some random digits and text there, and the same with constraints. So that is okay. You could create it that way, but the way I initially showed you with creating the table login is where you actually indicate the name. So if you use the keyword constraint, you can actually give that a name, which I always find is the better way to do things. We also are going to be doing some other videos on the channel on how to create tables and the different types of constraints. There's also a unique constraint that we haven't covered in this video. and then we'll be looking at altering tables, dropping tables, altering constraints and dropping constraints as well. So I really hope you have enjoyed that scenario that we've gone through there today, guys. Don't forget, if you'd like me to do a video on any area you're struggling with, please do post it in the comments below and I will do my very best to get that up as soon as possible. Check out my other videos on the channel if you're interested in anything to do with data, so learning SQL, business intelligence. If you've got interest in SSIS, SSRS, there's some reporting videos coming soon as well. Do subscribe to the channel and click that notification button so you're made aware of when I am uploading videos. Thanks a lot for watching.